They had swords, spears, and the fire of a nation fighting for its life. The English had one weapon, a 6-foot piece of wood that changed medieval warfare forever. This is the story of Madog ap Llywelyn, the prince who stood against King Edward I, and the single hour at Maes Moydog, where the Longbow turned an army of patriots into a helpless, bloodied mess. The cold iron fist of King Edward I tightened its grip on Wales. Every ancient law, every proud tradition, was systematically crushed beneath the weight of English administration, leaving behind only the bitter taste of resentment and mounting debt. This is the story of how that oppression sparked a fire, a desperate, righteous rebellion led by the last true Prince of Wales. Summer of 1294. All across the mountainous heartland, life was dictated by the new English shires. This was more than just a change in governance. It was a cultural extermination carried out by bureaucratic decree. Edward I did not simply want to rule Wales. He wanted to re-engineer it into an English province, erasing its distinct identity and converting its assets into royal revenue. Tax collectors, judges, and sheriffs, many of whom spoke no Welsh at all, and none of whom cared for Welsh custom, replaced the traditional local lords, the ancient Uckelwr who understood the reciprocal relationship between the people and the land. The entire English administrative system, operating out of new county towns, was focused on extracting wealth and loyalty. New, suffocating taxes were imposed, such as the hated levy on movable goods, a tax amounting to 1/15 of all personal property, forcing impoverished farmers and minor gentry to choose between sustenance and compliance. The economic pressure was crippling, but the legal humiliation was systemic. English common law superseded the ancient, nuanced laws of Llywelyn. This legal shift was particularly devastating because it denied the Welsh justice in their own tongue and tradition. A Welsh farmer could lose his ancestral lands to satisfy a simple English debt under a system he didn't understand, with court proceedings conducted entirely in the foreign French or Latin tongue. A respected noble could be humiliated in court, his word counting for nothing against an English clerk, simply because of his bloodline. The entire structure of Welsh society was being dismantled, piece by bloody piece, a systematic humiliation designed to make the conquered people forget who they were. The massive, intimidating castles Edward I was building Caernarfon, Conwy, Harlech stood as physical monuments to their permanent subjugation. Every toll collected, every English market founded, was a deliberate, calculated step to annihilate the Welsh identity. This was the peace that followed conquest, and it was becoming intolerable. The land was ripe for an explosion of ancient fury. Yet, among the dispirited Welsh nobles, a new hope quietly circulated: the name of Madog ap Llywelyn. Madog was no mere warlord. He was a cousin of the late great Llywelyn ap Gruffudd, the final recognized Prince of Wales. His ancestry traced back directly to the royal house of Aberfraw, lending his cause a sacred legitimacy that no other leader could claim. Madog himself had not been an enemy of the English at first. He had spent years attempting to reclaim his family's lost patrimony, the lordship of Meirionnydd, through the English courts, believing in Edward's justice. He had even been an English royal pensioner for a time, but when his claims were constantly denied and the rewards for his loyalty proved meager, his personal grievance merged with his nation's fate. In the eyes of the Welsh, Madog carried a legitimate, sacred claim to the title of Prince of Wales that Edward I had tried to erase. His lineage was a living promise that Welsh independence was not dead, merely sleeping. His personal story, the loyal subject turned revolutionary, embodied both the royal claim and the common frustration. As Edward I himself busied his armies fighting a new, expensive war in France, the people of Wales looked to the horizon. They saw not a king's ransom in English soldiers, but a fleeting divine opportunity. They saw a chance to reclaim the ancient freedom they cherished above all else, and to end the oppressive administration. The air grew thick with rumors, then with planning, and finally with an unspoken collective agreement. The moment was now. The flame of revolt was about to be lit by the man destined to become the last great symbol of Welsh resistance. Madog's revolt didn't start with a formal declaration. It began with an act of devastating, symbolic violence that instantly signaled the scale of their intent. In September of 1294, the uprising was coordinated to strike across Wales simultaneously. The key strike, led by Madog, targeted the English-held town of Caernarfon, the very seat of the new English administration in Gwynedd, and the most potent symbol of Edward's steel-willed conquest. The attack was swift, coordinated, and utterly shocking to the English occupiers, who were caught completely unprepared. Madog's forces descended, seizing the town, killing the hated sheriff, Roger de Puleston, and driving out the foreign administrators. The core act of liberation was the destruction of the administrative heart. The records, the crushing ledgers of taxation and debt, the writs, the charters were hauled into the town square and ceremonially burned, turning the very documents of oppression into a bonfire of liberation. The sight was intoxicating, a physical manifestation of the shackles snapping. From the ashes of Caernarfon, the revolt spread like wildfire in dry grass. Madog was quickly declared Prince of Wales, Tywysog Cymru by his supporters, anointing him with the authority to challenge Edward I directly. This was more than a military act. It was a political and spiritual assertion of independence that echoed the reigns of the great princes of old. All across northern and central Wales, English positions crumbled. Castles like Hordern, Ruthin, and Castell Llywelyn were seized. Even in the south, leaders like Morgan ap Merdud and Sinan ap Merdud rose up, capturing Morlaix Castle and laying siege to Builth. English garrisons were overwhelmed by the sheer, furious speed of the uprising, which was far more widespread than the English had anticipated. Conwy Castle, one of Edward's largest fortresses, where Edward I himself was soon briefly trapped, was besieged, its massive walls reduced to a desperate island in a hostile land. Welsh lords who had previously bent the knee to Edward I, like the men of Powys and Gruffydd ap Rhys, now flocked to Madog's banner, their loyalty returning to the old ways. Madog's army was a reflection of the people he led, farmers, tenants, and townsfolk, unified by shared desperation and led by a fierce, charismatic commander. Their tactical strength lay not in heavy armor, which they lacked, possessing only quilted jack chains and leather, but in their long Welsh spears, a formidable weapon when used in a dense, defensive formation, and their ability to move quickly across the rough, familiar terrain. Their forces were initially successful in several engagements, notably defeating the English Lord Henry de Lacy near Denbigh in a routing ambush in November. For a fleeting moment, the dream of an independent Wales was not a distant wish. It was a reality fought and won in the streets and valleys. Madog and his forces won several decisive engagements against hastily raised English feudal levies. They were winning. But King Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots, was not a man to suffer such an insult. His response was already moving, slow but unstoppable, toward the Welsh horizon. The news reached King Edward I in London, shattering his plans for a continental campaign. The great king, famous for his cold, calculating fury and military experience, saw the rebellion not just as a threat to his territories, but as a profound personal affront. This was the land he had spent a decade and immense treasure conquering. This was his trophy. His response was immediate and absolute. He shelved the French war, diverted his vast military resources, the most professional war machine in Western Europe, hardened by years of Scottish and French warfare, straight toward Wales. He personally led one major thrust into the north, arriving at Conwy just before Christmas, where he and his retinue were promptly trapped by the Welsh revolt and had to be resupplied by sea. This early setback only intensified Edward's resolve. If you're captivated by stories of impossible courage and resistance against empire, make sure you hit that subscribe button now. We bring you epic military history every week. Edward didn't rely solely on his own beleaguered northern column. He entrusted the crucial task of crushing the revolt in the central marches to his most seasoned and ruthless commander, Thomas de Beauchamp, the 6th Earl of Warwick. Warwick was a man of immense power, known throughout England and the marches for his strategic mind, tactical acuity, and unflinching loyalty to the crown. His force was the very antithesis of Madog's passionate rabble, disciplined heavy cavalry, formidable English infantry, and the devastating, newly perfected English longbow formations. These longbowmen were not feudal levies. They were professional soldiers, designed for industrial-scale killing, capable of ignoring the usual restraints of medieval campaigning. Warwick's strategy was simple: relentless pursuit. He ignored the seasonal difficulties that often stalled medieval campaigns, driving his professional force through the winter. His goal was not merely to engage the enemy, but to annihilate them strategically, forcing a pitched battle on terms favorable to the English. While King Edward was briefly pinned down and besieged at Conwy Castle, Warwick carried out a brutal, methodical campaign of territorial recovery and encirclement in the centre. He systematically recovered lost castles and relentlessly harassed the Welsh supply lines. Throughout the harsh winter of 1294, Warwick's forces pressed Madog's men, driving the Welsh prince southward and forcing him away from the relative safety of the northern mountains. This constant pressure was designed to wear down the poorly supplied Welsh army both physically and psychologically. Warwick was slowly, methodically, maneuvering the Welsh army into open ground, the one type of terrain where the Welsh advantage in terrain and spears would be completely neutralized by the English superiority in mounted shock troops and missile fire. The initial, glorious rush of Madog's rebellion began to fade into a grim, exhausting retreat. The moment of truth was no longer a question of if the armies would meet, but where the inevitable, final battle would take place. By the early spring of 1295, Warwick had Madog cornered near the Severn Valley, forcing the Welsh prince to choose his ground or be hunted to exhaustion. The trap was set, but Madog didn't see it until it was too late. The chosen field was Maes Moydog, a stretch of open ground near Welshpool in Powys. It was not a mountain pass or a river crossing. It was precisely the kind of land the Welsh had traditionally avoided because it favoured the heavy horse. Warwick, executing a brilliant night march, surprised the Welsh army encamped in the valley. Yet, Madog had calculated his move carefully. He believed his men could compensate for the terrain by deploying their greatest strength, the dense defensive spear formation known across the Celtic world as a skiltron. On the morning of March the 5th, 1295, the Welsh army deployed with a quiet confidence, massing their spears into a hedgehog of death on a slight rise of ground. Their formation was a solid wall of iron and wood, the spears held upward and outward, an answer to the terrifying power of the English knight. If the English cavalry charged, they would simply be impaled on 1,000 points of steel, a proven tactic that Welsh and Scottish forces had used repeatedly to break the shock attack of heavy knights. Madog was betting everything on the spear's ability to negate the English advantage in heavy armor and horseflesh. The attack came exactly as Madog predicted. Thomas de Beauchamp opened the battle with a devastating charge of his heavy cavalry, the elite knights of the English crown. It was the shock assault that had broken armies across Europe, but the Welsh spearmen held firm. For a few glorious, terrifying moments, the skiltron proved unbreakable. Horse after horse went down, ripped apart by the sheer density of the spears. The English cavalry broke and recoiled, bleeding and confused, a brilliant momentary victory for the defenders. The Welsh roared in triumph, believing they had won the day. But Warwick was no ordinary general. He had a fatal lesson he'd learned against the Scots, and he was about to use it to turn their greatest strength into their tomb. Instead of recommitting his broken cavalry, Warwick made the tactical decision that would define the rest of the battle and, indeed, much of the next 100 years of European warfare. He ordered his cavalry to pull back and deploy his infantry, specifically the English longbowmen. These archers, unlike traditional feudal bowmen, were equipped with weapons of enormous draw weight upwards of 100 pounds, capable of punching through chainmail and hitting at ranges far exceeding Welsh short bows. They were marched not directly toward the schiltron's front, but to the flanks, where they could loose their volleys without being impaled by the front line of spears. The sky darkened as the first massive hail of arrows descended not onto the English lines, but onto the trapped, dense mass of the Welsh schiltron. This was no longer a battle of valor, it was a mass execution. The spearmen, masters of close combat, were helpless. Their own formation, their greatest strength, had become their coffin. The roar of battle was slowly swallowed by a terrifying, incessant thrumming sound, the sound of thousands of arrows ripping through flesh, leather, and wood. The Welsh, trapped in their static formation, had no defense. The longbow's advantage was its tremendous rate of fire. A skilled archer could loose 10 to 12 arrows per minute, and penetrating power at long range. It could deliver a crippling volume of fire before the enemy could close. Unable to advance without breaking formation and exposing themselves to the cavalry, and unable to retreat without being cut down from behind, they were forced to endure the arrow storm. Men fell by the score, their shields splintered, their armor useless against the sheer penetrating power of the English longbows at range. The schiltron began to ripple and collapse under the psychological and physical pressure, no longer an invincible hedgehog, but a frantic, dying mess. Seeing the Welsh formation finally shatter, the Earl of Warwick gave the order for the second cavalry charge. This time, the attack met no resistance. The heavy English knights rode into a field of panic and carnage, cutting down the surviving Welshmen as they tried to flee. Many Welsh soldiers were routed toward the nearby River Banwy, which was swollen by winter rains, and drowned in their haste to escape the merciless English advance. The Battle of Maes Moydog was not a close fight. It was a brutal, systematic slaughter. Estimates suggest 700 Welsh soldiers were killed, compared to around 100 English losses, a devastatingly lopsided result. The popular revolt had been crushed in a single afternoon by a tactical masterpiece that secured the power of the longbow for centuries to come. Madog ap Llywelyn, the briefly crowned Prince of Wales, was among those who fled, escaping the slaughter. But his cause was lost, his army scattered into the surrounding countryside. The dream of independence, which had burned so brightly just months before, was extinguished beneath a rain of English arrows. The English victory was absolute, decisive, and irreversible. Warwick had fulfilled his grim duty, ensuring that the next time a Welshman tried to defy King Edward I, the horrifying spectacle of Maes Moydog would be the first thing he remembered. If this cinematic breakdown of medieval warfare captured your attention, please take a moment to comment below and let us know which other historical battle you'd like us to cover next. The battle was over, but the war's final, tragic act was still to play out. Following the devastating rout, the English forces pursued Madog relentlessly. The prince was a fugitive, hunted across the land he had briefly ruled. By the summer of 1295, his luck and his support finally ran out. Madog was captured, likely betrayed by men who knew the immense price on his head and the futility of continued resistance. His capture marked the definitive end of the rebellion. Madog was taken to London, where he was fortunate that Edward I chose not to inflict the same gruesome execution suffered by his cousin, Dyfed ap Gruffudd. Instead, he was imprisoned for life in the Tower, where he would disappear from the pages of history, the final legitimate Welsh prince reduced to a footnote in King Edward I's triumphant reign. The English king systematically consolidated his victory, replacing any lingering vestiges of Welsh autonomy with an ironclad administration. Maes Moydog became the gruesome blueprint for English military supremacy, a lesson that Welsh resistance, no matter how passionate, could not overcome disciplined professional soldiery and the terrifying technology of the longbow. The legacy of the battle was that it cemented English control over Wales for generations. The rebellion, while crushed, was not forgotten. The courage of Madog and his spearmen, and the brutality of their defeat, became a powerful, tragic memory woven into the fabric of Welsh identity. That memory would serve as a crucial ember, lying dormant beneath the ashes of conquest. Nearly 2 decades later, a new fire would ignite when Owen Glyndwr, claiming his own royal lineage, would raise the banner of rebellion once more. He did so not in defiance of a long-dead past, but as a living echo of the freedom that Madog ap Llywelyn had briefly touched and tragically lost on the killing field of Maes Moydog. Do you have a history enthusiast friend who needs to see this story? Share this video and help us spread these incredible, forgotten moments of history. The story of Maes Moydog is the tragic reminder that courage alone cannot defeat a tactical evolution. It is a defining lesson in warfare, paid for by the final bloody sacrifice of medieval Wales. If you want more deep dives into the battles that shaped our world and defined the boundaries of modern nations, make sure to subscribe to our channel and leave a comment below. We are dedicated to bringing you the history that history forgot.